Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Adobe Theatre here at the Photography Show. Guess what? My name is David Noton, and what I'd like to do with you this afternoon is introduce myself and my work, my attitude towards it, both in the field and subsequently in post-production. And I want to take you through the processing of one picture in a very clear, logical, measured and precise way, which is of course the way to work when you're working on your pictures. But first I'd just like to set the scene by talking a little bit about what I do. And I have to admit, I would rather be here on the banks of Loch Marie on a beautiful May evening than stood here in the National Exhibition Centre. Nothing against Birmingham, but I live for these moments, these gorgeous moments where the light's painting the landscape. And I put an inordinate amount of work into being in the right place at the right time. Pictures like this don't happen by accident. They're the product of a lot of preparation, location searching, and working on being there for that decisive moment when the light is just perfect. Most of my shoots will involve going back to one location many, many times. But I've been a professional photographer for 33 years now, and in that time I've traveled the world, been lucky to have gone to virtually all four corners of the planet for my photography. So I don't just photograph landscapes, I photograph the people on my travels as well. And of course, in my 33 years in the profession, I've seen some immense changes in the world of photography. Not just in the way we take pictures, the technology, the cameras that we use, but what we do with the pictures subsequently. You see, this picture here on the screen in front of you now was shot over 20 years ago in the Namib Desert there, and it was shot on a big old beast of a panoramic film camera, no electronics in it, on film of course, and so much has changed, hasn't it, and what we use. But really the essential elements of what makes a picture work hasn't changed one bit. This picture works because of the quality of the light, the simplicity of the location, simplicity of the composition, the drama of the location. There's one element though that I think just lifts the picture too, and that's this tiny figure there in the landscape, giving the whole scene a sense of scale. The fact that that tiny figure is actually my wife Wendy gives for me the picture that added resonance. So in my time, as I said, I've seen some real changes. Just last month was working in Colombia, just back from that trip. Wonderful, tropical, colorful trip, that one. I shot this hummingbird there. Again, I spent all morning working on this picture, waiting for just that right moment when the hummingbird flew into my frame and hovered at the point of focus. I would travel all the way to Colombia for just one picture, if that picture is good enough. My whole approach to my photography and my post-production workflow can be summed up with the concept of quality over quantity every time. And what I do, why I do all these travels nowadays, is to publish this, the F11 Photography magazine, which I really do think you should subscribe to. Every month I publish in it these kind of features and post-production tutorials and videos. And that's become the whole central purpose for my photographic travels as I travel around the world producing content for this. So come back to this picture just shot last January on the Jurassic Coast down in Dorset where I live. Again, it took 4 visits to get this picture, going back, waiting for the moment when the light was just perfect on the landscape there. the elements that make the picture with the drama of the landscape, the time of year I shot it, a winter's afternoon, and of course the drama in the sky as well. So persistence is a really important thing for me in my photography, and when I've got a good idea for a picture, a good location in mind, I'm like a dog with a bone. I'll just keep going back again and again and again until I get the picture I want. I was lucky enough with the super blue moon that we had just over a month ago. I shot it rising over Stonehenge. Again, a shoot that all came down to a very kind of I planned exactly where I needed to be to capture the moon just as it popped over the horizon there. Okay, so I want to take you now and let's come out of here, and I'm going to take you into Lightroom now. And what I want to do is talk to you about what I think is really important in the way that you work with your pictures. And I'm going to use an example of a shoot I did in Brittany last September here, and it was gorgeous light, evening light on this area called the Pointe de Penier, near in Finistère, French Land's End. And before I start on this picture, I would just like to sum up the fact that really, looking at these shots, these are the raws straight out of the camera. I haven't done anything to them yet. And really, it's not a bad starting point, is it? Because there's not much that needs doing to these pictures. I believe very strongly in getting it right in camera, making sure you've got the perfect exposure. I've used a filter here on the shoot to hold back the sky, and really now in post-production all I'm doing is fine-tuning the picture, fine-tuning the contrast, fine-tuning the color vibrance, fine-tuning the brightness of the image. But the first step always is the exposure. You can see up the top here, right of the frame, that's the histogram display showing me the same histogram display that I would have seen on the back of the camera. Now we have these cameras that have incredibly sophisticated metering systems, don't we? You can virtually turn your camera on, put it onto through the lens metering and allow it to do its thing, and you will get a perfectly acceptable exposure 99% of the time. But we can do better than that, because we can fine-tune this exposure here to maximize, wait for it, the signal to noise ratio, i.e. maximize the amount of information that our camera is recording. What do I mean by that? Well, I mean using exposure compensation when you're behind the camera to make sure that this histogram is pushed as far to the right as possible, i.e. giving it as much exposure as possible without clipping highlights. More on that in a minute, but that's been the really important thing. Start with getting it right in camera. If you do that, then the post-production on your images is absolutely dead easy. Okay, so before I go into the develop module, you'll notice here that I've put in here my caption information. Very important that, because Lightroom is an excellent piece of software, not just for processing your pictures, but for managing your photo library, your collection of pictures. And if you get into the habit of captioning your picture at this stage, as you import the RAWs into Lightroom, then when you come to subsequently 6 months, a year, 5 years from now, you can use Lightroom to find those pictures using those kind of words as your search, as your keywords to find the pictures you need to. So really important to put that caption information in at this stage. Okay, so let's go to the develop module now, and let's just work through the post-production on this picture. And before I get started, one thing I should say to you is that I believe that Adobe's put these various adjustments that you can make to the picture all the way down the right-hand side of the screen there. Now, just because there is an adjustment slider there does not mean you have to use it. I believe strongly that the less you do to a picture, the better. Keep it simple. Only make an adjustment if you have to. And I know some people approach the way they process their pictures by randomly playing with every slider available, hoping to stumble across a magic solution. Well, it doesn't work. Okay, so if in doubt, do nothing. It makes for a very simple life, quite frankly. So I'm looking at this picture now, and the first thing I come to is the color balance. Now, generally speaking, I hardly ever adjust the color balance. I shoot my pictures with daylight white balance set in camera, and because I'm a landscape photographer, I love the nuances of natural light that Mother Nature gives us. So, for example, here, the sun's just setting. We've got this lovely warm light, just very soft, the last direct sunlight of the day on the cliffs there, and that pinkiness in the sky. Now, why on earth would I want to adjust that? And generally speaking, with all my photography, particularly my landscape photography, I keep my camera set to daylight white balance, and I hardly ever alter the white balance subsequently in post-production. So, as I said before, I'm just gonna, if in doubt, do nothing. So I'm gonna bypass the color white balance section, and before we start tweaking the brightness and the contrast of the image, I just want to come down here to this area here, where it says, first of all, there's two boxes here. One, it says, it's the lens corrections tablet here. And the first thing I'm going to do is just click on enable profile correction. And can you see what it's done here is it's recognized the camera I've used and the lens I've used, and it's applied correction, what are called lens corrections. Now, lens corrections are there because there's no such thing, apart from in an ideal world, of the perfect lens. Every lens, no matter how much you spend on it, distorts the image to some extent. And every lens is also brighter in the center than it is in the corners. So what this is enabling us to do is actually correcting that vignetting and the distortion. If I click the button on and off, you can see the difference there. But bear in mind that every adjustment you make, everything you do in post-production is a subjective call. There's no right or wrong. So I'm going to say what I'm doing here this afternoon. You may choose to do something completely different, and good on you. But I believe with lens corrections in particular, there are times when I really do want to correct that unevenness of coverage, the darker corners and the brighter center, and other times when I don't. And in this particular instance, I don't. I think the darker edges actually benefits the picture. And a little bit of distortion, thank you, a little bit of distortion is no bad thing. So I'm not going to apply those lens corrections. But what I am going to do is remove chromatic aberrations. So if I just zoom in on this picture here, really tight, and I'm going to go in even tighter now. Just put my glasses on. Yeah. So I'm going to zoom into one, oh no, larger than that. Okay, now can you see this stack here? Now if I click off chromatic aberrations, then I don't know if you can see it on the screen very well, but can you see on this side of the rock stack here, there's just a hint of a sort of pink line. And on this side of the rock stack, there's a hint of a green line. Those are what are called chromatic aberrations. They're a lens fault, and all lenses have them. A cheaper lens will have more chromatic aberrations than a more expensive one. But you really notice these at huge magnifications, particularly where you've got a high contrast edge like this. So I basically can correct those chromatic aberrations by ticking that box. And in fact, I do that to every image. Can you see that color fringing has now gone? So there's no drawback, there's no creativity to applying chromatic aberrations. I think that I effectively apply those corrections to every image. So let's now go back and start getting creative with our adjustments. And what I would recommend is, before you start working on your picture, just push your chair back, put the kettle on, have a ginger biscuit, look at your picture and ask yourself, what does it need doing? And often, hopefully, the answer will be not that much. In this particular case, I think the image, I've exposed the picture in camera to maximize the signal to noise ratio, to maximize the amount of information I'm recording in that precious raw image. The net effect is a perfect exposure, but a picture that looks just a bit too bright. So the first thing I can do is something about that. But what I always start with is looking at the black and the white point in an image. What I'm referring to is the darkest tone in the image and the brightest tone. And generally speaking, this is a rule that's made to be broken, of course, but generally speaking, in the perfect image, we want a complete range of tones, from a pure, rich black to a sparkling, biological Daz white. So the first thing I'm going to do is look at my black and my white points. And if I click on the black slider here and hold down the Alt key, and if I move my black slider to the left, what I'm doing is I'm adjusting. If you look at the histogram top right, you can see I'm moving the left shoulder of the histogram to the right. If I go too far, that's showing me where I'm clipping my shadows. So what I want to do is move it as far as I can to the left without clipping shadows, because every pixel is precious. So we're looking for optimum shadow detail, but a pure rich black as well. So I can go to about there. Oh, just come back on that a touch. To about there. I'm going to do the same with the whites. Now hold down the white slider, move it to the right. And as I keep going with that until I start to clip my whites. Come back, and that's about right. Now I have optimum contrast in the picture. If I just show you the before and after there, you can see it's a minimal adjustment, but it is there. We've optimized the contrast in the picture. But it still looks too bright. So what I'm going to do is I could now just darken down the picture. Two ways I can do this. I can just use the exposure slider here. But actually, I prefer to use the tone curve, because I think it's a really effective tool. And just by pulling the tone curve down to the right, I darken down to the image, give it that kind of density and the impact that I want to give. And already we're making the image, we've got an image that has much more impact, much more contrast. Now, one thing we've done is, because we've enhanced the contrast range in the picture, that's had the effect of boosting the colors. Look at the pinks in the sky there. Look at the tones in the rocks there. Now, that's something to bear in mind, because the next stage of our journey through the post-production workflow is looking at this area here called presence. Now, I would suggest to you that this area of the develop module should come with a public health warning, because at this stage of the process, it's really easy to get a little bit carried away with your adjustments and end up with a picture that is just a bit too overcooked, with colors that are just a bit too boosted and unreal. What do I mean? Well, let's come back to the clarity slider in a minute, but the vibrance slider is there to boost the colors that are not already completely saturated. So you can see if I boost vibrance there, then very quickly we start to get pretty nauseous looking image. you're going to start feeling pretty sick. If I go the other way, we can take colors out. And actually, that's quite an effective thing to do now and then if you're wanting to go for just really minimal color, just a hint of color. But generally speaking, with my images, I think I'll just put maybe just a teaspoonful of vibrance into the picture. Really, I think if you find yourself dialing in more than about 15 or 20 on the vibrance slider, you really do need to ask yourself some serious questions. And it's really easy to think that just a bit more color vibrance will give the picture more impact, whereas in fact the opposite is the case. You very quickly get to the point where you're degrading your picture. The saturation slider boosts all the colors equally. As such, I hardly ever use it. I tend to use the vibrance slider. And just to reinforce the message, subtlety is the key. I see so many pictures ruined by over-the-top processing. So keep it subtle. Now the clarity slider is there to give, it essentially boosts local contrast. Now if I move the clarity slider right over to the right, can you see the effect it has? It has the effect of sort of boosting the detail here in the rocks, but at the same time it's introducing a harshness to the picture that I find very unappealing. Generally speaking, I don't use the clarity slider much at all. I do with my black and white work, but in color I don't. But I would stress this is very much a subjective call and one that you need to think about as a photographer. Just as an aside, go the other way with the clarity slider, and it's like taking us back to the wedding photography of the 1970s and 80s. Do you remember those diffusion filters that photographers used to put over the lens that softened the whole image, spread the highlights? Well, taking clarity out of the image is essentially doing the same sort of thing. Sometimes it's quite fun to do, but again, subtlety is the key. So I've come down here, I'm looking at this picture now, and I'm thinking, what else needs doing to it? Quite frankly, not a lot at all, really. We've got a perfect histogram, the picture's got impact. It doesn't need any more work, really. But one thing I do need to address is the issue of sharpening. And all pictures need sharpening. That's not because I haven't got the picture in focus. It's not because I kicked the tripod while I was making the exposure. It's not because I'm using a cheap lens. It's because all digital images need sharpening because they're made up of pixels. And pixels need sometimes to be told when you're looking at like a hard edge here. What sharpening is doing is actually just reinforcing that edge, forcing the pixels either side of that edge to make a decision on which side they want to be. So let me just illustrate what sharpening does here. So I've come down here and come to my amount slider here, and if I go right over maximum, sharpening, can you see the effect it has on the picture there? It's a bit like the clarity slider. It adds a harshness. And if I zoom in on some detail here, now if I come out, that's no sharpening at all. The image looks soft. So clearly it needs some element of sharpening. How much is the key? If I go completely the other way, you can see that has the effect of really crisping up the detail, but at the same time it's adding this horrible sort of pixelation to the image as well. So in fact, what we need to do, just come out on the magnification a touch here. We've got to have somewhere in the middle. And what I do is actually I use one of these Lightroom presets down here. It's called Sharpen Scenic. Now this is a preset that Adobe reckons is a good starting point for your landscape pictures. And I agree with them. I use it all the time. It makes for a very simple life. I like simplicity in my pictures. I like simplicity in my post-production. So if I select Sharpen Scenic, and it applies this amount of sharpening. Now if I zoom out again on the image here, so that's taken care of that, but there's one thing I still need to deal with regards to the sharpening. Now sharpening is great for tidying up the fine detail in a picture, but in the areas of the image where we have no fine detail, such as the sky and even the sea, we don't want to sharpen those pictures, because sharpening introduces this sort of grittiness, almost like grain, and that looks horrible in these fine gradated areas of tone. So I can use a mask here, which allows me to control which areas of the picture the sharpening is being applied to. So again, if I hold down the Alt slider and move the masking slider to the right, can you see where the black is? No sharpening is being applied to that area, only the white area. So what I want to do is just adjust this masking so that the sky and the water is selected, but not the landscape. Now, it's going to be somewhere around there. Now, these kind of adjustments will make, if all you're ever doing is just posting this image on Facebook as a small JPEG, then these kind of fine-tuned adjustments won't make much difference at all. But what really makes a difference is when you're preparing an image for print. Now, I love printing images. I think it's getting us back to what got us into photography in the first place. And this picture is shot with that 50 megapixel Canon 5DSR, so super high resolution image. It could be printed up huge and look really crisp and beautiful. But when you print images big, this is when you start to see the benefit of this kind of attention to detail that I've been talking to you about this afternoon. For example, the lovely gradation of colors in the sky. That's where paying attention to your adjustments and paying attention to your exposure in camera in the first place will really pay off, because the more color information you've got in that precious raw image, the richer your colors will be in the print, the more beautiful your gradated tones will be in the sky. So this kind of attention to detail will really pay off when you come to print. A lot of people think with digital photography that you can just blast away and sort it out later. It's not true. There are tremendously flexible cameras, tremendously flexible software. Combine the two with this kind of attention to detail, an ordered way of working, and you will net the result of increased quality in your pictures, which you really see when you print them large. I think really, on that note, that's pretty much where I'd like to leave it this afternoon. I think I've pretty much summed up the whole workflow process there. As you can see, what I did to the picture was not a lot. It took me far longer to explain it to you this afternoon than it would have taken me to do it in the digital darkroom. Most pictures I only spend a few minutes on maximum. Keep it simple, keep it subtle, it always works. Before we part our ways, I would just like to stress that the F11 Photography magazine is there for you with these post-production tutorials every month.